Hello, Stuart Tan here. I just recently conducted a training program for parents, and it was primarily focused around the NLP idea called anchoring. And I wanted to share a little bit more about anchoring because I believe it is a very useful and powerful skill, and at the same time a lot of people actually get it wrong. So in order for you to do anchoring, it needs to be based on the fundamental understanding of what it is, which is stimulus response conditioning. There's always a stimulus, or what I call a trigger, and there's always conditioned responses, which is called the behavior or the effect. So simplest way to put it, when you're thirsty, it acts as a stimulus for you to go and get something to drink. Likewise, if you see a red traffic light, stimulus is there for you to stop. You go to the traffic light and you stop. The question here then is, how do I modify a person's behavior? Now, in neuro-linguistic programming, there are many aspects of behavior that you need to know in order to change it. For example, just because you anchor the behavior does not necessarily mean that you will be able to repeat that behavior, because there may be certain situations at play. For example, people might be embarrassed by the fact that they are being mentioned, for example, and therefore they don't exhibit the behavior. In the case of a student who doesn't do his homework on time and procrastinates all the time, you can anchor motivation in this person for all you know, but it's not going to be effective, because it may simply be because he just doesn't want to do what you say. And we all know many teenagers who actually feel like, I don't want to do whatever my dad says, right? So it's important for us to distinguish the strategy from the technique. There are many strategies you can use to get people to do what you want, but just using a technique alone doesn't necessarily help. So I like to distinguish these two things, the ability to coach someone in a direction versus the ability to use tools. Of course, if you have more tools, the more likely your strategy will succeed, but if you only have tools and no strategy, it's very unlikely for you to move somebody there. So let's go back to anchoring being stimulus response. So for example, if I want to build an emotional state, I'll sit the person down and I'll get the person to go back and revisit memories and go through a process called revivification. I'll tell them, go back to the time where you actually experienced a particular emotion. So for example, if I want to present an anchor of confidence, I'll say, go back to the last time you felt confident. And as you feel confidence brewing up inside your body, I want you to hear what it was like for you to feel confident. What were people saying to you, and what were you saying to yourself? And at the same time, notice what you see, experience the feelings that are going on inside your body, and notice how good it feels for you to actually have this confidence back inside of you again. And as this happens, you might also notice that your entire body begins to shift its physiology. You might end up sitting straight up, you might actually be breathing slightly more differently. And as a result of that, it'll give you a little bit more indication from the behaviors that the client or the person, the anchoring target, actually is shifting his or her emotional state. Yeah? Physiology changes, emotional state is being changed as well. So this is the point of time where I might actually anchor the person. I might actually reach out and touch the person like that. And when that happens, it must be placed at the right time. So the anchor has to be built up, the emotional state has to be built up, and close towards the peak of the experience, I want to place an anchor there. My strategy is actually to anchor along the way, if I want to intensify the state. And I prefer to utilize a combination of different types of anchors. A multi-sensory anchor is actually more useful than a single sensory anchor. So contrary to popular training, there's a lot of people who tend to use kinesthetic anchors like this. So if you just use kinesthetic anchors, there may be a tendency for you to limit the modality. For example, he may not be responsive to the feeling at that point of time. When I'm wearing my jacket, for example, it's padded, and if you want to anchor me on my shoulders, it's not going to have the same feeling as without my shoulder pads, right? Likewise, if I just use an auditory anchor, if the place is really noisy, I actually lose out one of my modalities, and so on. And visually, sometimes we just have such a tiring day. Whatever you see on the outside actually is going to feel or sound quite different, or appear quite different. So of all of these three modalities, I tend to use a combination of them. So I'll tell people, go back to the last time where you felt confident of yourself, see what you see, hear what you hear, feel what you felt. And at this point of time, notice that you can allow the sensations of confidence to build up inside of you. And as that happens, I want you to notice that it can intensify. From whatever level it is right now, I want you to intensify it by making it bigger, brighter, closer to you. Intensify the sounds that might be happening around you. And as you notice that, I want you to feel that sensation of confidence inside of your body. Say what you normally would say if you're confident. Do you normally say, go for it? You know, things like that. So the phrase itself acts as an auditory anchor, something that you yourself can control. The kinesthetic anchor could be, clenching of the fist, or, doing something like this, so that you can revisit that emotional state anytime you choose. So whenever I am in a situation where I want that state, I'll just do this, yeah, right? And I get back that emotional state. So as you build it up, the anchor is visual, auditory, kinesthetic. I implement it there, I plant it, and then later on, when I want to fire off the same emotion, all I need to do is do that particular action, say that particular phrase, and the images will tend to come up. Once the images come up, I'll take some time to experience it, because feelings do come out after you give it a little bit of time, and you'll be able to feel the sensation. Now what happens then is you have a great sense of that confidence once again. The confidence that will continue to grow, right? So this is about anchoring yourself. So every time you do this or do this or do this, you have a way of triggering off that emotional state. And we all know that emotional states will actually trigger off specific actions or behaviors. Now, while this is useful, the question now is, how do I anchor someone else? Now this is a little bit tricky, but let me spill the beans on this a little bit more. Sometimes you also want to combine multi-sensory anchors with certain states. For example, sometimes when I'm telling a really sad story, I'll change my tone of voice. And my pace will change, and I'll allow for a little bit of silence in the background. And sometimes this state will be incompatible with a very happy kind of state. Yay, right? So I wouldn't have this kind of body language if I am speaking in a slightly slower tone, because it's just not congruent. Therefore, it is important and imperative for me to change the location where I stand. Now that itself is a visual anchor. It's called spatial anchoring. What I therefore want to do is to be able to stand in specific locations to do specific things. In NLP is a principle known as keeping the states separate. I like to do this because I don't want to stack a whole bunch of unrelated anchors. I want to take a little bit of control to design my place and my space. So, think about it. When you experience what it's like to utilize neuro-linguistic programming anchoring techniques, it really is about designing it effectively, working on the intensity scale, knowing when to apply the anchor, and knowing that you have to use it across multiple senses. As you are gaining more experience in this, I highly recommend that you test out one after the other. For example, there could be certain gestures that you use in order to create an anchor. Think of the ways in which you gesture. And if you review this video, you'll notice that there are certain gestures that I tend to use, right? Certain kinds of gestures. And these are not just useful for public speaking, they also are useful in the process of shifting people from one state to the other. After all, it's always useful for people who are viewing you to view you positively, usefully, and just generally create good states for no good reason. Because after all, we're already pretty good at creating bad states for no good reason. There's a quote directly out of Dr. Richard Bandler, who had said, since we are creating nonsense in our cocktail, why don't we just make a better cocktail? So, end of the day, what we want to do is to ask, what kind of behavior do I want to create in my child or my subordinate or whomever, and catch the state that actually drives this behavior. And every time I want this behavior, I just need to fire off the state, right? So, in normal day-to-day behavior, when the behavior is not yet, when the desired behavior is not yet exhibited, I will observe when the person is doing right, and I'll anchor that state. If that person happens to be very focused, concentrated, I will anchor that state, and every time I want this person to anchor and focus, I will fire off the anchor so that the person can concentrate and be more patient. Alternatively, there may be some who may need a sense of fun or calm. Likewise, I'll take a look at moments where they're calm, or intensify that where it is appropriate, and I may notice, for example, wow, you appear so calm and relaxed, and if they respond to me like, huh, what do you mean? Now that's a different state which I may want to anchor for some other things, but if my intention was to anchor calmness, that's obviously not calm. I need to observe, right? In NLP we call that calibration. So I'll just sit back and I'll watch and observe, and sometimes I'll just get the person to have a very calming conversation with me, and then I'll reach forward and anchor the person on the shoulders, touch them in a particular way that reminds them of this particular feeling of calmness. So the next time I want them to be calm, I'll just fire off the anchor. So I've planted it, now I want to fire it. I reuse that emotional state in an effective way. So always remember that anchors can be created to review or to revisit emotional states on demand. It's like a push button method, so that you'll be able to revisit these experiences on a regular basis powerfully. So think about how you can apply this, because knowing the theory and knowing the process does not always entail that you'll be able to use it in your context. And that's one of the reasons why people actually attend NLP practitioner certification programs. End of the day, you need to ask yourself, why is it that you want to apply anchoring? Under what circumstances? And where will you identify the triggers? Where would you calibrate to the build-up of the emotional state? And can you test it? Because at the end, the proof is in the pudding. You need to test it out so that you feel more and more confident in utilizing anchors, right? So therefore, go out there and test it out. If you want to understand the full works of neuro-linguistic programming and how anchoring can be done, you definitely need to experience what it's like in an NLP certification training program. I tend to give as many examples of how I personally have anchored other people and how that actually made a difference in the way in which they performed and the way in which they behaved. So it is a very powerful technique. Do remember that there are people who use this for only personal gain, and while that is not entirely a bad thing, please be aware that we already are using anchoring in a relatively unuseful way many times in our lives. So it's time for us to gain control. Understanding how that software doesn't operate with our operating system will therefore allow us to realize, hey, you know, why did I even install this software in the first place? If it was useless, I can get rid of it and consciously no longer use it anymore, and install useful ones so that I'm more empowered, more in charge of my emotional states. So I hope that kind of helps you a little bit. For more information about my NLP practitioner training, feel free to head down to stuarttan.com for a registration. And you know, if you've got any questions, feel free to comment on my YouTube feed, and I'll be very happy to answer them in due course.